Welcome to the 8th talk on world history, and this will be now about ancient Greece. But this particular talk will be based around, in a sense, a Bible study on the book of Daniel. And the reason for that is because Daniel really is pivotal to understanding world history, because it's given to him, uniquely really, amongst all the prophets, an understanding of the events of, you might say, the secular world as opposed to the kingdom of God or Israel. But obviously, the secular world that Daniel's thinking about is the secular world as it impacts the children of God. So the first person, or the first prophecy, I should say, that we come across in Daniel comes in Daniel chapter 2. And it's here that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And in that dream, he sees a statue. And I'm going to show you a picture of this statue. So if you bear with me, I shall draw this up. Now, in this event, it is Daniel that seeks God's wisdom to be able to interpret the statue. And it's that interpretation of the statue that really gives us an opportunity to see world history played out, really from the point of Nebuchadnezzar right through to, in a sense, I'll just see if I can find my world history. So hopefully that's now being shared. And so we have an opportunity here to, as it were, see this particular statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees. And the statue starts with a head of gold. It then has, that's head of gold here, and we're told that that is King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kingdom. So we're talking about here around about 580 BC. And that kingdom lasts in effect until 530 BC, when it is taken over by the Medes and the Persians, which is the silver chest. And that is under Darius and Cyrus. We then have this kingdom replaced by the brass kingdom. And the brass kingdom in the waist to the knees represents the Greeks whom we are thinking about. And obviously that is the time of Alexander the Great, about 330 BC. And the Greeks are ultimately replaced by the iron legs. And the iron legs represent Rome. And that is replaced in the end, though it's very vague at this point, by the feet of iron and clay. Now, the Romans take over the Greek Empire really around about 100 BC. And in the West, at least, the Roman Empire concludes around about 400 AD. In the East, the Roman Empire doesn't technically finish until the fall of Constantinople. I think it's around about 1450s. So we have here the Roman Empire coming to an end, and it's replaced by the 10 toes. And the description that's given is very interesting, because the description that's given for this particular period can be found in Daniel chapter 2. And you notice that in that particular chapter, it says this, and it's verse 41. And I'll go to verse 40. And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all those things shall it break in pieces and bruise. And that is the description of the Roman Empire. It basically destroyed or controlled everything it took over. Verse 41, and whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of the potter's clay, part of the iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for much as I saw the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Whereas I saw the iron mixed with miry, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but shall not cleave one to another, even as iron and is not mixed with clay. So it's very interesting that when we come to the toes, we are actually talking about a set of kingdoms which are united but disunited. And that's an incredible description of Western Europe. Really, when the Roman Empire came to an end, there was might say, a manifestation of a new form of Roman Empire. But this time it was partly united, partly divided. It was united around a common church, the Roman Church. But it was divided because they were all separate nations warring against each other, but never able to conquer one another. They partly saw each other as friends, they partly saw each other as enemies. And I think that's a wonderful description. And what's interesting is that at this point it then says, and in the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And so that is where Daniel ends the prophecy, with the stone destroying the statue and the stone being not made of human hands. So I think we have here a reference to the second coming and the conclusion of this aspect of human history. So I'm going to finish with this slideshow because I haven't got any more slides, because I'm not really sure the copyright for all the other pictures that I would be using. So if you dare bear with me, I'll just finish this. So I hope you see that the second chapter of Daniel really does provide a very interesting and comprehensive account of human history as seen from God's perspective, but with reference to secular history. And I'm going to show through the rest of Daniel's prophecies how that common theme is then played out. If we were to go to Daniel chapter 7, you would begin to see a very similar picture. This time, the picture is of a set of beasts. The first beast is clearly the one that represents Babylon. It's a lion with wings. Now, if you've ever been to Berlin and you go to the Pergamon Museum there's an amazing set of what I call a walkway into Babylon that has been, as I say, preserved in the museum. And in that walkway, you'll see tiles with this winged lion, and that represents Babylon. The second beast is a beast that is a bear, and that represents the Medo-Persians. The third beast is that of a leopard, and that represents the Greeks. Interestingly, this one has 4 wings. Now, I'll come back to the 4 wings a little bit later. Okay? The fourth beast is the great dreadful. It says here in chapter 7, verse 7, and I saw in night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, strong exceedingly, with great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, stamped the residue of its feet. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Again, this concept of 10 horns. Now, just to make sure that we all understand that this prophecy is then, as it were, carried over into the book of Revelation, you would find in the book of Revelation, in chapter 13, a description of the beast. And that same beast has 10 horns, as we have just described. And in that beast, we read this description, chapter 13, verse 1. And I stood on the sand of the sea, and a beast rose out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And upon his horns were 10 crowns, and upon his heads were names of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet were the feet of a bear, and his mouth was a mouth of a lion. So you can see that the 4 beasts that we come across in chapter 7 of Daniel are having a manifestation in the book of Revelation. So the 2 are tied together. Now, at this point, I should really explain that I am following a traditional church interpretation that's widely accepted, certainly by the early church fathers, by the reformers, by the people of the Wesleyans, and also by the Victorians. And actually, to some extent, there's nothing here that I've said that would be in disagreement with the church people of the current this age, the 20th and 21st century. When I come to look at the book of Revelation later, I will depart from probably the traditional, I'll depart from the current view, which tends to be what we call the futurist view, that sees the book of Revelation being fulfilled in the last 7 years of history. And I will stick to what I consider to be the traditional church view that was held by the early church fathers and by the reformers and by everyone up to the mid-Victorians, which was what was called the historicist view, that says that the book of Revelation is an unfolding of 2,000 years of church history, rather than a reference to the last 7 years. So if you're wondering where I'm coming from, that's where I'm coming from. But for this interpretation of the book of Daniel, that's not that relevant because it's held by almost all the church people, this particular interpretation scheme that I'm coming across. So when we come to chapter 8 of Daniel, what we find is a slightly different prophecy. It's of a ram and a goat. The ram has 2 horns and represents Medo-Persia. By the time of this prophecy, by the way, the Babylonians have ceased to exist and they've been conquered by the Medo-Persians. So in that sense, Daniel isn't so much talking to the Babylonians, he's talking to the Medo-Persians. The goat flies through the air and is effectively very quick in dispatching the ram. And he has only got 1 horn, and that horn is Alexander the Great. What is interesting in the book of Josephus, we find that Alexander the Great is about to come to Jerusalem to destroy it, when the priests have a timely dream. And I think Alexander the Great has the timely dream that he says he's going to be met by people in white with a book. He used to pay attention to them. Anyway, so the story goes, the people in white were the priests of Jerusalem who came out to meet Alexander the Great and showed him these prophecies and said, well, this is you. You realize that God has obviously chosen you to do this job. And I think Alexander was very impressed by this and decided not to destroy Jerusalem. Anyway, it's an interesting story. I can't vouch for its validity, but Josephus certainly mentions it. And we certainly know that Alexander the Great didn't destroy Jerusalem. What happens in this particular prophecy is that we then hear that the 1 horn of Greece gets suddenly broken into 4 horns. And it states quite clearly that the 4 horns are nothing to do with the 1 horn in terms of being blood relatives. And the interpretation is, in effect, when Alexander dies, suddenly his kingdom will be split into 4. And that's what actually happens. There are 4 generals that take over. And out of this particular 4 horn situation, we hear of a single little horn that appears again that will speak blasphemies, and this is generally interpreted as Antiochus Epiphanes. And we will come across him when we come to chapter 10 and 11 of Daniel, where we have this very detailed prophecy of the kings of the north and the kings of the south. And the kings of the south are the Ptolemies who rule in Egypt, and that's from the general Ptolemy. And the kings of the north rule in Syria, and that's Seleucus, who's one of the generals who sets up his family to rule in the north. And Antiochus Epiphanes is one of the children, I should say, comes from the northern kingdom and from Syria. And it's very interesting what happens here, because, and it's actually quite relevant to our own period of history, because Antiochus Epiphanes represents the Greek way of thinking. Alexander the Great brought to the whole of the Middle East, we might say, a Hellenistic worldview. The Greeks were very proud of their philosophers, very proud of the people who, and Aristotle was Alexander the Great's teacher. And there was a rich tradition of thinking, of plays and of drama. The Greeks, with their athletics, the Greeks felt they had something to offer the world that was unique and superior to everything else. And in many ways, they called everybody else barbarians. And this sort of, might say, cultural superiority that the Greeks felt, you can almost say is a bit like the Western world today with our sense of cultural superiority. Obviously, we're right. We know we're right. Everybody else is wrong. We may not express it so bluntly, but we do that. Yeah. And that was certainly true of Antiochus Epiphanes and that Hellenistic Greek worldview. And of course, it's clashed with the Hebraic way of seeing the world, which was quite different. And this came to a head, as I say, with Antiochus Epiphanes, who basically forced the Jews increasingly to have to do things the Greek way. And this caused great tensions amongst the Jews. Should they accommodate to Antiochus Epiphanes and his worldview and thereby escape persecution? Or should you stand up for the truth that you see in the scriptures and accept that actually you're going to be at odds with the worldview that's dominating? Ever was it thus, I'm afraid to say. And in this case, there was deliverance. The Maccabees overthrew Antiochus Epiphanes when he finally went too far and tried to establish pigs in the temple, which is about as offensive as you can get. In truth, in terms of world history, it's not always been deliverance that Christians have found. Very often they have found persecution and persecution unto death. And we get this in the book of Hebrews, where you have a whole list of saints who find deliverance in chapter 11, but then there's a mention that there are many who don't, who end up being sawn in half and dying horrible deaths. And tragically, we see today the same thing happening. And the British government has published a report recently in which it said, as far as they are concerned, this is the greatest untold story today, that over 260 million Christians are suffering severe persecution and thousands are dying every year. And it's getting worse. So, in a sense, the story of Antiochus Epiphanes is still relevant today. And I fear that Christians have suffered persecution over the years. And it's not to say that other people don't, and one has to be horrified at the situations happening to people such as the Uyghurs, and one's heart goes out to that situation. But it is also the case that Christians have suffered tremendous persecution over the years. My final part of Daniel I want to look at is an amazing part, and rather, I think, establishes the, shall I say, the authority of the Bible like no other prophecy I can think of does. And that is Daniel chapter 9. And in Daniel chapter 9, you have a prophecy not referring to the secular world anymore. This is referring to the children of God and the coming of the Messiah. And this is actually after a time of intense prayer for the children of God, and actually a prayer of repentance for their sins. The children of God are not perfect. They are just as capable of sin in some ways as anybody else. They do need to have a relationship with God. They do need to follow his ways. If they don't, they end up sinning. And if you have found that Christians haven't always been perfect, that is because they are redeemed sinners. They are quite capable of being imperfect. It's just that they do have the power of God in them, so they have the capacity to follow the truth. If they don't, well, that's their choice. We are humans. So certainly the children of Israel had not been following the truth. They had gone into gross sin, and as a result had been, as it were, exiled to Babylon. And that's the point of the prayer. Well, in the prayer, Daniel gets an answer. In that answer, God shows him the coming of the Messiah. And what is interesting is in the coming of the Messiah, it isn't as a deliverer from any occupying power. It is, in fact, very clearly a coming of the Messiah to deal with a problem. And the problem is the problem of sin. It says in Daniel 9:24, 70 weeks are determined upon the people and upon the holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation from iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness. It's very clear that the Messiah came to deal with sin. So it's very interesting that's what Jesus did. Whereas at the time thought he was coming to deliver them from the Romans, Jesus was under no illusions. That wasn't what he came to do. He came to deal with a much more important problem than the Romans, and that was their personal sin. The second interesting thing about this prophecy is in verse 26. It says, "And after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself." This is referring to the death of the Messiah. And we get this in Isaiah 53 and in Psalm 22. The death of the Messiah is predicted. Again, this should have come as no surprise when he died on the cross, because it is predicted in Scripture. That's what's going to happen. And interestingly, I believe that in the 1st century BC, the Jews had an understanding that there seemed to be two Messiahs in the Old Testament. The Messiah that they call after Joseph, the suffering Messiah, and the Messiah after David, the triumphant Messiah. And I think that's very wise, because I think it's very clear when you read the Old Testament, there are two Messiahs. And of course, we now understand that because the first Messiah came as a baby in a manger and died 33 years later on a cross. The second coming of the Messiah will be in glory and in triumph. And we can now see the reconciliation of the prophecies, why you have this apparent two Messiahs. But they are the one Messiah, just coming at two different times. But what really seals for me the significance of this chapter as a proof that the Bible is the revelation of God and is accurate and true and should be respected as such, comes in this particular verse. Verse 26 of chapter 9 of Daniel. It says this, and I said it already, that Messiah will be cut off, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Jerusalem was going to be destroyed after the Messiah was cut off. And the prince was Titus, the son of Vespasian, the Caesar, at this period of history, which was 70 AD. And of course, Jesus spells this out when he's on the Mount of Olives. And you find that in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Very clearly, he tells people, Jerusalem will be destroyed. And of course, this was the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9. So why Jews thought the Messiah was going to deliver them from the Romans and bring peace in the sense that they were thinking of, that was never going to be the case. The peace that the Messiah brings is that we have peace with God, because through Jesus Christ we have salvation, because his death on the cross dealt with sins and transgressions and iniquities, as was described in verse 24. And so you can see that in Daniel, we had this amazing set of prophecies that tells us about the Greeks, introduces us to the Romans, and tells us about the Messiah. Now, in my next talk, I will develop the history of the Romans and what happens when their empire collapses. Thank you for listening.